to be honest, it's hard to even understand why the Dalai Lama or the so-called Tibet opposition movement is even useful at this point. But I think it goes back to, I know you both talk a lot about color revolutions. And if any one of these dominoes were to be delegitimized, then what already is a pretty weak project. I mean, Hong Kong was soundly defeated. The Xinjiang issue has essentially been made completely and utterly ridiculous and exposed as such. And now with Tibet, I mean, it's quite obvious that China has already consolidated Tibet and really integrated Tibet into its national project. And there's no reversing that trend. But regardless, if any one of these weapons for the United States is to be delegitimized, then the entire project is at risk. And I think that's why you see all of this defense of the Dalai Lama. And I grew up in the Northeast. I grew up in a city in the Northeast. And I got to say, there's a lot there. The Tibet opposition movement, they come to the Northeast. They live here. And, it's quite clear just how much support they've received to be kind of the useful pawns of the United States' war on China, because they have received so much privileges for doing such a thing. And Dalai Lama gets to live very high and very well in India after making, what was it, 180,000 per year, just to continue on this ridiculously useless and utterly unsuccessful campaign to try to rip Tibet away from China. So it is really, truly disgusting. And it just goes to show how far the U.S. and its allies will go to protect even the most, what I feel like are marginal projects at this point, because there's just absolutely no hope for the U.S. and its allies to get anything out of the Tibet issue other than propaganda talking points and scoring some points in its larger war.
Yes, absolutely. And I want to point something else out. When the West comes together and tries to defend the Dalai Lama for something that's entirely indefensible, all this does is give more ammunition to extremists on the other side who have zero tolerance or empathy for people who have whatever their personal issues are. And it almost vindicates in their own mind that, all of this tolerance, human rights, all of this is nonsense, because look at how they're defending some guy who did something totally indefensible. And I don't know if people saw this on Twitter, this Oslo Freedom Forum. I've talked about the Oslo Freedom Forum. It is U.S. government funded, and the BBC even did a short video on it where they said they come here, they train to overthrow their country, and then they go back, and that's what they do. And the Hong Kong mobs, we all know, were funded by the U.S. They trained at the Oslo Freedom Forum, and they went back. And so here's some lady speaking for Tibetans. She's got a North American accent. I believe she's based in Canada, and she's talking about repression in Tibet. And I showed the document. Where was it? I don't know. I talked about the U.S. backing, the CIA backing Tibetan rebels, terrorists, and this continues to this day. So this is the NED, U.S. government, NED. And if you look through the names of these organizations, this has nothing to do with human rights, okay? It has nothing to do with human rights. And if you look at the names of some of these, the International Tibet Network or the Students for Free Tibet, and you go to their websites and you read it, they talk about separatism, creating an independent Tibet. It's occupied by China, they claim, and they want independence. So this is the U.S. government funding separatism, again, in absolute violation of the UN Charter. And this is what this is who they're defending right here. The Dalai Lama, the head of all of this thing that they've been doing since the 50s. This is what it's all about. So it has nothing to do with religious freedom or the poor Tibetans. And the Dalai Lama is just another example of the type of people that gravitate to the U.S. And it's schemes. We have Nazis in Ukraine. We have terrorists all over the Middle East, in Syria especially. So it's just an endless cycle. And the thing I want to ask you both real quick before we wrap up, because we're coming up to the hour. So we saw the BBC apologizing for the Dalai Lama, and now it's complaining that it's being slapped with the government-funded label on Twitter, as if Why would they do that? Why would they defend the Dalai Lama? We see that he's a component for regime change and separatism in China. It has nothing to do with human rights. And so why would they object to being called state-funded media unless it's just to hide the fact that they're state-funded media there? So, Angela, why don't you start? What is with the BBC and also PBS and NPR all complaining about the state-funded label?
Well, because it exposes the fact that they are not independent. They have to follow the propaganda, the government agenda. So they are, they're just speaking on behalf of the government for a geopolitical agenda. So that's the reason. But I mean, who would actually go against that, against this narrative? I mean, if you are from Great Britain, everybody knows that it's because they're paying I don't know what's the fee's name, but everybody has to pay that, and it's state controlled. So it's just embarrassing. But again, it's just if you speak to many English people, they will tell you that they used to have a huge respect to when it came to the BBC, but nobody has any respect anymore. And you see the lots of surveys when it comes to media in general. Just in the West, people do not believe the media. At least in some places, maybe in Russia, the difference is that if there is propaganda, they know it's propaganda. In the West, people they don't even know. They are just eating propaganda all day long. But there's no trust. Again, I look at simple data when it comes to trust towards the media, trust towards the government. We are at the range of 30 to 40%. When it comes to media and government in the collective West. When it comes to government, Russia 80%, China 95%, media probably much higher when it comes to China, because China, I've been listening to Chinese media for a long time. There's one very big difference that China does. They report the news, but they don't tell you how to think. Meaning, really, every single media, they are not going, but this is very cultural. In the West, we need to know who. It's got to be white or black. Who's the bad guy? Who's the good guy? It's like Hollywood movies. How is the good guy? No, well, you get the news in China. They give you the news that's factual. Well, make up your own mind. Just think up for yourself. But they're not going to tell you who's the good and bad guy, unless someone is cutting the head of someone, and they're going to say, well, that might be a bad guy.
Might be a bad guy. Yeah. Danny, so again, the BBC, and I've heard this argument, this drives me crazy. The argument is, well, no, the people are paying this TV license fee, so it's not government funded. And the BBC is also saying this. This is their argument. But in reality, the government is enforcing this. They're collecting it and giving it to the BBC. So not only is the BBC state funded, I want to point this out too. The Grey Zone did an excellent article. This was a while ago. Reuters, BBC, and Bellingcat, they were all caught taking British government money to do an information operation against Russia. And they're saying it's not government funded because it's the TV license fee. But in reality, all they're doing is kind of laundering it in a way, but actually isn't all government funding collecting some sort of fee or tax and then giving it to whatever. So again, common sense. And then also the BBC is not only government funded, state funded media, but now they're trying to lie about it on top of it all. So it's indicative of everything that they have always been doing. They lie about everything, including what they are and how they operate. Danny?
Yeah, it's pretty absurd. I mean, we all know, I believe, about Operation Mockingbird conducted by the CIA. That was essentially institutionalized across the collective West media after it was formally outed. I mean, this is, even regardless, if the BBC was a private company, 100% through and through, what didn't have any public funding or government funding, it's the way that it operates. It's what service it provides. It's how it conducts its so-called journalism. It's just an embedded institution. It really is just an extension of the UK and, of course, the US's foreign policy establishment at this point. But what's so just, I think, infuriating about this too, just what's so ridiculous about it and just so absurd, is that the BBC objected to what already was a tepid label. They were called government funded, while Chinese media, Russian media, Iranian media, they all get the state affiliated type. So there already was a qualitative difference in those labels. One, saying you're government funded doesn't necessarily have the same definition and connotation or implications as being state affiliated. So Chinese media, Iranian media, Russian media all still got to look like they're just some kind of agents and dictators of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. But BBC just got a small label of being government funded, which is factual. Now, I just read this morning that Elon Musk has caved to this and now is calling BBC publicly funded media. So that's how much influence also the Western mainstream media has, is that it's itself a lobby organization. It itself is a power broker within the political establishment across the collective West, and it influences institutions, huge mega corporations like Twitter, to change its behavior based on its shallow and narrow interests to keep a propaganda war going. Because that's really what they're objecting to. They're objecting to any kind of challenge to the propaganda war, any kind of parody in the propaganda war. Now you can't even have a label that's relatively accurate. Publicly funded government funded media, it's accurate. The British government does fund BBC. It's ridiculous to say it doesn't. But because that adds a little bit of parody to this whole state affiliated media attack on China, Russia, Iran, and Venezuela and other countries, that in and of itself is enough for the Western mainstream media to absolutely lose their minds over this. And to me, it's just so absurd. And it just goes to show what role what Western mainstream media really plays. It's not to inform us, it's to deceive us and to normalize and sanitize what the foreign policy establishment wants to do around the world.
Well said. And I mean, isn't that the whole point with the BBC? It doesn't even matter whether they were funded by the government or not. What is their role? Who was cheerleading the war, the invasion of Iraq, the WMD lies? It was the BBC. And I've seen people say, well, you can't compare the BBC to RT. You're right, you can't, because Russian state media called out the lies about WMDs. The BBC was there cheerleading, and they've done the same thing ever since. So a lot of excellent points there. Angelo, you have any final thoughts on this or anything else?
Well, you mentioned RT. It was interesting. I followed very closely the Yellow Vest movement in France. And you know how RT became really, really big was because RT was the only one to follow doing live streaming on this movement, which was massive. People got really frustrated. There was not a single channel, French media, that was covering the Yellow Vest. RT did it, and it became actually the most influential media in France until they closed it. And in qualitative, actually, you know, I haven't seen much restriction. You see people randomly on RT like criticizing, you know, being not necessarily pro Russia. So it's interesting. Actually, we tend to, you know, the collective West tend to say this propaganda Russia side. I think it's way more. We are in the West way more. We have much more propaganda in general. You know, you see actually on Russian channels, you have openly people criticizing Putin. That happened. I don't see much. In the collective West mainstream media.
Yeah, that's also a good point. Even the Telegram channels, which are, you know, more or less independent media, they're pro-Russian, but they criticize Russia. In the pro-Ukrainian, they're in a fantasy world, and it's very regimented. If you step out of line even a little bit, you might find yourself on a kill list. Danny, do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, no, I mean, just to extend on to what Angelo was saying, it truly is just a matter of how the collective West media plays its role on the world stage, and the fact that it can still attempt, right? The BBC is attempting to salvage some kind of journalistic identity, while at the same time being one of the main arbiters and agents for the prosecution and persecution of Julian Assange. And, going along with British intelligence, U.S. intelligence, in its real persecution of journalists through, whether it was the Obama administration, Trump, Biden, their war on whistleblowers, what's going on with Assange and Snowden and all of that. I mean, all of this bluster and hubris around, well, we're actually independent. We're really independent. We're not just some government mouthpiece. It's just pure, not only hypocrisy, but it just exposes how much they really are mouthpieces of these governments. I mean, it's astounding that more and more what we're seeing, I think, when it comes to just how delicate and chaotic and crisis-ridden this political situation worldwide is you see in the geopolitical situation worldwide is you see every reaction from the collective West, whether it's media or it's foreign policy brass, what we're seeing, we're constantly seeing these like admissions. Even when they're trying to state an opposite position, if you're just a thinking person, you can see. If you think at all a little critically, you can see exactly what they're actually saying. They're actually saying that they are these mouthpieces of the war machine and of a war machine, and they're just trying to distance themselves from it. And it's just so obvious the more and more these kind of antics go on, and they'll continue because the propaganda war only gets more and more shallow and debased as time goes on against countries like Russia and China and the multipolar world. It just gets more and more absurd, and the more absurd it gets, the more ridiculous and absolutely pathetic, honestly, the collective West looks. And it's only going to hurt the global reputation of countries like the UK and the United States for conducting itself in this manner. And I think that's one of the most important points, is seeing the isolation happen in real time on the information realm, the economic realm, political realm, all of it. It's the isolation is only going to intensify the more that the collective West thrashes about to try to maintain the supremacy that it thinks it can hold on to forever.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. They're isolating themselves. There was a point that I wanted to make. I didn't drink a cup of coffee before I got started here. Danny, you were talking about BBC having a meltdown over this and how serious they got over this seemingly tiny issue, but they know that all of the so-called legitimacy that they have is an utter illusion. It is a smokescreen. There is no substance, zero substance, and they know that if it starts with this label, it will not stop until that whole smokescreen is blown away by the wind of truth. And so that's why they fought tooth and nail. That's why PBS and NPR, whatever it's called, this is why they're literally going to leave Twitter, because they cannot allow this to stand. They have to stop this before it goes too far and everyone starts waking up. Because when people wake up, they don't go back to sleep. You can trick people for quite a while, but when they wake up, they don't go back to sleep. And I guess that's kind of what all three of us here are attempting to do, wake up people as much as possible. I want to thank you, Angelo, as always, for joining me on your Friday evening. Thank you, Danny, for joining us on your Friday morning. And it was a great conversation. We're definitely going to have to do this again. I want to thank everyone who tuned in live. Please check the video description below. All of Danny's information everywhere you can find and follow his work is there. Also, Angelo, also all of my different accounts and everything. So thank you again. And until next time, bye for now.